The joke came out of nowhere, the way the best and worst ones do. It was a Tuesday night in November. I'd been at Phoebe's apartment for 2 hours longer than I planned, fixing a dripping kitchen tap her brother had promised to fix 3 months ago and never did. Griffin had called me on my lunch break. "You're good with this stuff, she's right across the bridge. It's just a washer." It's always just a washer with Griffin. I fixed the tap in 20 minutes, then she made tea and I sat down. When I finally looked up from our conversation and caught the time on the oven clock, it was nearly 9:30. I stood up to get my jacket and noticed the wool throw on the reading chair by the window, cream-colored, heavy, with a dark pattern woven through it. Outside, the October mist had become something colder and more committed. I picked up the blanket and wrapped it over my shoulders with a grin. With weather like this, maybe I should just stay. Phoebe looked at me. She went a little quiet, one of those silences that feel longer than they actually are. Then she smiled, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and said, "The couch pulls out." That sentence changed the direction of my entire life, but before I tell you why, I need to go back. My name is Adam Fenwick, and I work as structural engineer for a consulting firm in Victoria, British Columbia. I design bridges, pedestrian crossings, overpasses, the kind of infrastructure people use every day without thinking about it once. I like that. I've always been more comfortable with load calculations and material tolerances than with conversations that require me to reveal anything. Victoria suits me. It's a city that lets you disappear into the quiet, if that's what you want. I've been divorced for 2 years. My ex-wife's name is Monica. She works in marketing or strategy for a tech company in Vancouver, one of those roles with a title so long it gets shortened to an acronym nobody questions. She's sharp, driven, the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately calculates who's worth talking to. She wanted a husband who matched her pace, her ambitions, her 5-year plan. I wanted to design bridges and kayak the inner harbor before work. She called that complacency. I called it knowing who I am. We didn't fight the way some couples do. No screaming, nothing thrown. It was quieter than that, months of conversations where we covered the same ground and ended up exactly where we'd started. She wanted me to take a position in Vancouver, build something scalable, stop being so satisfied with small. I didn't know how to explain that my small life fit me perfectly. We signed the separation papers in a lawyer's office on a gray Wednesday afternoon. I didn't blame Monica. I was just exhausted from apologizing for being myself. After the divorce, I found a rhythm that felt clean. Morning kayak on the gorge before the mist lifted, long hours at the drafting table, evenings alone with leftovers in a silence that started to feel like a choice rather than an absence. I lived inside my own routines and didn't ask for more. I thought I was fine. I mostly was. Then there's Griffin. My younger brother is 29, manages a craft brewery taproom in James Bay, and has never successfully remembered where he put his keys. But Griffin is the reason I met Phoebe, and for that I owe him more than I'll ever say to his face. I met her at his housewarming, about 18 months before any of this. 30 people crammed into the apartment, someone's playlist too loud for the space. I was standing near the kitchen with a beer I didn't particularly want, watching the room. And Phoebe was at the small table near the balcony door, a sketchbook open in front of her, quietly drawing the potted monstera in the corner. At a party, drawing a plant at a party. I stood there a moment before she noticed me. She didn't look embarrassed. She tilted the sketchbook toward me so I could see, a clean, careful pencil study of the leaf structure. "I'm a botanical illustrator," she said. "I can't help it." I told her I was a structural engineer, and I also couldn't help it. She laughed. We talked for almost an hour without either of us noticing the time. I drove her home. She lived near the cemetery on the other side of Cook Street, and on the way she pointed out an arbutus tree leaning over a garden wall, bark peeling to that particular warm red. I said they were my favorite thing about this coast, that there was nowhere else in Canada you could find them. She said she agreed. I went home that night and thought briefly that she was one of the more interesting people I'd met in years. Then I put that thought somewhere safe and didn't look at it again. I wasn't ready, I told myself. Still too close to Monica, too protective of the particular piece I'd built. So I didn't pursue anything. I was just Griffin's older brother, occasionally running errands. The November tap was not the first time Griffin had sent me to Phoebe's. Over the autumn it had happened 5 or 6 times, a bag of camping gear he'd left there, a check on her hot water pressure when she'd mentioned it felt low, a borrowed French press she wanted to return but Griffin couldn't swing by. Every time I arrived, handled whatever needed handling, and stayed longer than planned. And every time the ginger tea was ready. That's what I noticed first before I understood what I was noticing. Phoebe drinks jasmine tea. She has a whole shelf of it, but there was always a tin of loose-leaf ginger tea on the counter, the good kind from a little shop on Fort Street, and she always made it for me in the same wide, dark-glazed mug without asking. Once in October, I'd been about to say I'd just take water, but the kettle was already on. I'd mentioned ginger tea exactly once, 3 months earlier. In a 5-minute conversation about what we liked on cold days, she had written nothing down. She had simply remembered. There was also the reading chair. Her apartment isn't large, a 1-bedroom in Fernwood with tall windows and bookshelves along nearly every wall. She has a small sofa and an armchair by the window that looks out over the street and the line of mature oaks along the boulevard. The armchair always had the same cream wool throw draped over its arm. It was always empty, always angled toward the window. Phoebe sat on the sofa. Always. I never sat in the armchair. Somehow I never did. I'd notice it and then not think about it, the way you don't examine things you're not ready to see. Then came the December evening when her hand brushed mine as she handed me the mug. Just fingertips, half a second. She pulled back and looked at the window. I looked at my tea. Neither of us said anything, and the conversation picked up again easy as before. But something had shifted. I felt it the way you feel a change in pressure, not with your eyes but somewhere behind them. I drove home across the Johnson Street Bridge and thought, then I filed that thought next to the others I hadn't examined and went to bed. In January, Monica found Phoebe. Victoria is a small city. Monica had visited once after the separation to collect some things, and she still had contacts here. However it started, one Sunday morning Phoebe was at the Dallas Road Farmers Market, looking at dried botanicals for reference work, and Monica was there. Monica introduced herself with perfect composure and a smile that cost her nothing to give. She said she'd heard about Phoebe, and then she said, according to what I pieced together later, Adam is a genuinely good man. He's just still, you know? He'll let you wait a long time for something he might never actually be ready to give. I say that kindly. I learned it slowly. That was not kindness. That was a sentence engineered to outlast the conversation. Phoebe didn't tell me. She was too careful for that, but I felt the change the way I'd felt the other things, in the accumulation of small absences, texts that took longer to arrive, scheduling with more friction. When Griffin sent me over in February with a borrowed book, Phoebe was warm but contained, like a door left open an inch instead of all the way. The ginger tin was still on the counter, but the mug she handed me was a different one, plain white, the kind you'd find in any kitchen. I sat with that white mug and looked at where the dark glazed one should have been, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The armchair by the window still had the blanket on it, but the blanket had been moved to the seat of the chair, folded, instead of draped over the arm the way it always was. It sounds like nothing. It wasn't nothing. Griffin called a week later. I could tell from his opening that he was working up to something. Eventually he said, I need to tell you about Monica and the market. He'd gotten the story out of Phoebe after days of careful, patient pressing. They'd been close since their first year at UVic, and she'd finally told him. She cares about you, Griffin said. She's been caring about you for a long time. The tea, Adam, the chair, the whole thing. Why are you letting this happen? I didn't have an answer. I'd been asking myself the same question for a week. I called Monica that night. I didn't raise my voice. I said what needed to be said clearly. That she had no right to that conversation, that we were finished in the way that meant completely, and that I needed her to understand that and let it be true. She was quiet, and then she said, You're protecting her. I said, I'm finally doing what I should have done 2 years ago. I drove home and sat in my apartment and thought about a cream wool blanket on a specific chair and a tin of ginger tea kept on a counter for someone who'd mentioned it once. I took a week. I ran the seawall before sunrise. I sat with Monica's words, he'll let you wait a long time, and acknowledged that she wasn't entirely wrong. I had been waiting, not for something outside myself to change, but for some internal threshold of safety I'd never actually defined. It wasn't that I didn't know how to be open. It was that the last time I'd been open, it had ended with 2 adults in a lawyer's office agreeing their life together didn't fit either of them anymore. And somewhere in that process I'd decided that being careful and solitary was safer than being wrong again. But Phoebe had been sitting with that uncertainty for months. Longer, I was beginning to understand, and she hadn't asked for anything. She had simply kept the kettle ready and the chair empty and trusted quietly that I would eventually see what I'd been looking at. I went on a Thursday evening in April, one of those clear spring nights that Victoria earns after a long winter, cherry blossoms finishing along the boulevards, the sky still holding light at 7 o'clock. I had nothing in my hands. No borrowed item, no errand from Griffin, no excuse. Just myself, standing at her building's entrance. She opened the door and looked at me, surprised first, then something careful moved behind her eyes. "Griffin didn't ask you to bring anything," she said, "not a question." "No," I said, "he didn't." She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame. She didn't invite me in or close the door. "I know what Monica said at the market," I told her, "and she was partly right. I have been slow. I have been careful in ways that probably looked like I wasn't paying attention, but I was paying attention to everything. I just didn't know what to do with what I was seeing." I paused. "I'm standing here with nothing in my hands because I finally figured it out." Phoebe looked past my shoulder for a moment. The hallway behind me was empty. When she looked back, her jaw had tightened, then released. "The blanket," she said. I waited. "I found it at a craft fair in Sydney. The woman who wove it called the color Arbutus Shadow." Her voice was low and steady, the way it got when she was moving through something she'd thought about many times but never said. "I bought it the week after I drove home from Griffin's housewarming and kept thinking about what you said, about the arbutus trees. That they were your favorite thing about this coast, that there was nowhere else in Canada you could find them." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I was going to give it to you as a gift. Then I thought, if I keep it here, on the chair, maybe you'll have a reason to come back. Maybe you'll sit in it one day, and I won't have to say anything." She swallowed. "I put it there 14 months ago." That number landed the way certain things land, not all at once but in a slow wave that keeps arriving. 14 months. That blanket had been waiting on that empty chair for 14 months. She had found it thinking of me. She had kept it there week after week, every time I showed up for a dripping tap, or borrowed camping gear, or a book Griffin had forgotten. Every time she filled the dark glazed mug with tea I'd mentioned once in passing. Every time I left and she put everything back in its place, and waited for the next reason I'd need to come over. "The ginger tea," I said. The corner of her mouth moved. "I don't even like ginger tea," she said, and something cracked at the edge of her voice. "I've bought 4 tins in 2 years, just in case." I had been holding the evidence of someone loving me in the quietest, most patient way I'd ever seen, and I had confused it for hospitality, for warmth, for someone who was simply good at taking care of details. I said, "Can I sit in the chair?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway. I walked in. I crossed the room and sat in the reading chair by the window, the one that had been empty for 14 months, angled toward the street and the oak trees and the April evening light. Phoebe crossed to where the blanket was folded on the seat. She lifted it without saying anything and laid it over my shoulders. Her hands were steady, mine weren't. Outside, the cherry trees were letting go of the last of their petals, white against the dark pavement. We didn't make any large declarations that night. That's not how either of us worked. But something that had been held at a careful distance went quiet, and the quiet felt like arriving somewhere. A month in, she left the dark glazed mug at my place. Just tucked it into my cupboard one afternoon without announcing it, and I found it the next morning standing beside my coffee cups and stood there looking at it for a long time. I bought a small native fern from the nursery at the Saturday market and left it on her windowsill without explanation. The next time I came over, it had been moved slightly closer to the light and watered. We learned each other the way careful people do, through objects placed quietly, through noticing and being noticed without making too much noise about it. The first time I held her hand, we were walking the breakwater in May, the water flat and gray on both sides, Beals watching us from the rocks below. I reached over without looking at her. She held on. Neither of us said anything. The wind off the strait was cold and neither of us mentioned it. 3 months in, Griffin admitted everything. Most of the errands had been invented. The camping stove had been at his own apartment the whole time. He had no apologies and he wasn't looking for any. "You would have kept talking yourself out of it for another year," he said. He wasn't wrong. Without his engineered excuses, I might have convinced myself indefinitely that I wasn't ready, while Phoebe quietly restocked the ginger tin and kept the chair empty and hoped. At 6 months, the city unveiled a pedestrian bridge I'd spent 3 years on, a quiet crossing over a ravine in Saanich, native plantings along the approach, something that felt like it belonged to the landscape rather than interrupting it. There was a small ceremony, a few counselors, a ribbon. Phoebe came. She didn't stand near the front. She stood at the edge of the small crowd with her hands in her coat pockets, watching. When the last person had gone, and the evening had gone still, she walked over and looked at the plaque on the railing. She ran her fingers along the edge of it. "I'm proud of you," she said. 4 words. Monica had never said those 4 words in 3 years of marriage. I stood on the bridge I'd designed and felt, for the first time in longer than I could measure, that the work I did mattered to someone who wasn't evaluating it. Not the project, but the person behind it. At 1 year, Phoebe moved into my apartment. She brought the blanket. It went on the reading chair we positioned in the corner, by the window that faces the water, where the arbutus trees grow along the bluffs above the strait. It lives there now, not folded and waiting but lived in, pulled down on cold evenings, shared. One morning I woke before she did and put the kettle on. When she came into the kitchen still half asleep and saw the ginger tea steeping in the dark glazed mug, she stopped. She looked at it and then looked at me. "You knew," she said, "about the tea." "I suspected for a long time," I said. "I just wasn't ready to let myself know." She picked up the mug and held it with both hands the way you hold something warm when the morning is cold. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Love with Monica was a negotiation, a continuous argument about who I was supposed to become and how quickly I was moving toward it. It was a condition I had to keep qualifying for, a standard I could never fully meet. Phoebe never asked me to become anything. She bought a blanket in the color of arbutus bark and put it on an empty chair, and kept a tin of tea she didn't like and trusted, without ever saying so, that I would eventually understand what I was looking at. She was right. It just took a clear April evening and nothing in my hands but the only reason that had ever actually mattered. If you've ever held the evidence of someone's love without recognizing it, turned it over in your hands, felt its warmth, set it down, and walked away, you know the particular weight of that realization when it finally arrives. Not like a sudden light, more like the slow way morning comes through a window you forgot to close. Gradual and then everywhere at once. The chair was never waiting for a cold night. It was waiting for me.